So I was offered these two topics, and it's very nice of the leading committee that I have 30 minutes time for two topics. Thank you. So first, historical description. Medial lateral and lateral medial is, as far as I know, Fabrice Bartholomé. So the description was based on intracranial EEG recordings without description of semiology in the beginning. And he found that there are seizures where there is very short latencies between ictal discharges, either mesial or lateral, and the other part of the temporal lobe, so from mesial to lateral or from lateral to mesial, when using SEEG vision orthogonal approach. And then there were two major publications on the semiology related on this from Chauvel and Maillard, which I will present to you. And the second topic about temporopolar origin of seizures was first described, as far as I could find it, in 1984 by the group of Fred Enderman in Montreal. And he reported variable semiologies in patients with temporopolar encephalocele, and we will see how this turns out in the later literature. So if there are main issues on this, the questions are, is it really a different semiology if we have mesiolateral or temporopolar focal seizures from other seizures coming from any other part of the temporal region, or is this unspecific? And the second is, do seizures of temporopolar origin really typically have temporal semiology at all, or does their connectivity lead to extratemporal symptomatogenic zones? So we did this search with these keywords. We had 239 PubMed hits, so a lot less than my speaker before me had to cover with. And we took any number of patients included, so including case reports, and only those articles where seizure semiology was reported to some degree of specificity. So this is what came out. 239 abstracts were screened, 33 articles completely read, and then we found additional articles to 7 who really provided semiological information, 10 more. And this is a total of 106 patients. So when we look at mesiolateral, this really goes back to 2 papers, which I will show to you in some detail, and with 51 patients. So the definition was inability of SEEG to differentiate between temporomesial and temporolateral seizure origin, or very rapid spread from mesial to lateral or vice versa. So this is the first study by Chassou et al. In 2004, and they compared mesiolateral anterior and widespread origin with mesial and with a few patients of bitemporal origin. So these were so few that it's difficult to really evaluate this, but they compared it to mesial origin. And out of this long list of symptoms which was reported, I took some differences which were not necessarily statistically significant, but appeared to be different when you look at the numbers. So with the mesiolateral, she described more frequent staring, about 45%, more frequent automatisms compared to mesial, mostly simple or alimentary, more frequent salivation, more frequent motor signs, more frequent dystonic posturing, more frequent version and head deviation, and more frequent secondary generalization. So particularly the latter symptoms that you see here, we will hear about later when talking about lateral temporal lobe seizures, and many of them are just differentiating also lateral temporal lobe seizures from mesial temporal lobe seizures. So the second study by Louis Maillard was very detailed, and he found quite a number of interesting findings which in part overlapped with what we just heard. So he described that medial and mediolateral seizures had more frequently an epigastric sensation, and lateral more frequently auditory illusion or hallucinations. he described that with the medial lateral, you had an initial loss of contact, earlier perhaps than with the medial, and early oral alimentary and verbal automatisms compared to the medial group and to the lateral group, and a relatively long seizure duration, which was different from lateral but similar to medial. So when we look in some detail on the findings that he presented in quite some detail, then you really saw that there was many differences shown from the lateral to the mesial group, and less so between lateral and mediolateral and medial to mediolateral. So for example, far less frequent and sensory hallucination, which were more frequent in the lateral group, and the differences between mesiolateral and medial in this group of subjective symptoms were not significant. In this table, you see that, again, there are many differentiating signs of lateral temporal lobe epilepsy, but not so much between lateral and mesiolateral epilepsy. And you also see here in this table of his publication that late oral alimentary or upper limb elementary automatisms were more frequent in the mesial compared to the other groups. So when we put this together, we see that in this mediolateral group of 18 patients, early vocalization was a typical sign, verbal automatisms, and early oral automatisms, whereas with medial seizures, there was a later loss of contact, a later oriental or elementary automatisms, and later upper limb automatisms. So also the sequence here relevant. And in the lateral group, you find quite a number of characteristics, so less frequent epigastric aura, less frequent fear aura, less frequent automatisms, more frequent hallucinations, rare dreamy state, and shorter seizure duration. So particularly these findings with the automatisms correlate to what also Chassou had reported, so that we have some overlap here. There was one study who looked at mediolateral temporal lobe seizures and spread of the activity to the insula, and they found that this was invaded later if it was mesial temporal lobe seizures than with mesiolateral temporal lobe seizures. However, they did not find any semiological correlates of these difference in spread. So if we do this systematically, we see this coming out. So we have a total of 33 and 18 patients with this mediolateral temporal lobe seizure semiology reported in the literature. And it was very different in terms of MRI and SEEG. But we find that quite a number of these patients became seizure-free. The problem is that all these patients were treated with anterior temporal lobectomy, so there is no specific outcome for this group that you could report. And I think that we can be confident in the epileptic shown with a very high degree in about half of these patients. So this is what is coming out in outcomes, so relatively many becoming seizure-free, and these statistics. So when we come to the semiology, I think that the evidence is best that there is more frequent early automatisms in this mediolateral temporal lobe group compared to other origins, and maybe a moderate evidence for early vocalizations more frequent, but otherwise there are quite a number of other signs and symptoms which were reported, but where the evidence that it is really specific is very low, because you find it in the other groups as well. So that far for the mediolateral group, and now we are getting to the temporopolar group. So here we had 11 articles with 55 patients, which I could identify with the search strategy. And here, to the level of evidence, I want to add something. So I regarded a very high level of evidence for a real origin in an area, that if you have either a highly localized resections performed with resulting seizure freedom, meaning a polar resection rather than an anterior two-third resection, or if you had SEEG with temporopolar onset plus seizure freedom. And otherwise, I consider this as not very high. So this is the temporal pole. You see here a definition. You see that this is relatively really localized here in this definitions as relatively very anterior in the temporal lobe. So, and it has quite a number of functions based on its connectivity being an area where lots of information is coming together. And I think given these many functions that are ascribed to the temporal lobe, it is really surprising that we can do resections here without major harm. The first 3 cases that I found that were reported were in fact with encephalocele, and this is going to be a major part of the studies that I will present to you also later, and as I mentioned, by the group of Fred Enderman. And here they found it without any MRI, but I regarded their imaging as equivalent to this. So the one patient had unpleasant sensation in the stomach, gripping movements of the head, forward flexion of neck, glassy stare. The next had staring pulse only for 30 seconds, frequently. And the next had paresthesias of fingers and toes, loss of consciousness, and walked around. So very different semiologies already in these first 3 cases reported. And I want to show you 2 illustrative cases from our group just to show if you would have thought that this is a temporal seizure. So here we had a bitemporal encephalocele. You see one very nicely shown on the MRI, and we had non-lateralizing PET, and there was no major cognitive deficits. And this patient had focal aware sensory warm feeling in the chest, focal aware dreamy feeling, and then tonic seizures. And this was our implantation. So we had a bitemporal SEEG coming really very close to the area where the encephalocele is. You can hopefully see this here, very close to the area. And you see here the seizure. I don't know, is this, it should not be part of the video. So you see, here is the seizure onset is going to come now. And you see now the spread, which is first here to the temporal region. The patient notices something. And then you see further spread of the activity before you really see major symptoms. And it's not so much of a symptomatology. Just if you see now the testing, you see that there is some tonic contraction of the arms. And this is mostly what it remains. So it is a bilateral tonic seizure with some type of aura, a warm feeling. Somewhat unclear. Who would say this is a clear temporal lobe polar seizure? So difficult to say, isn't it? Could have been also a frontal lobe seizure. So this is again the ictal onset and the propagation of the activity, and you see that it's relatively fast spreading here to other areas from the seizure origin in the temporal polar region. So we did a very circumscribed resection here in the very pole region. I hope you can see this here with the, now we can see this here. So this is the resection here, very anterior, and the patient became seizure-free. So I think this is quite good evidence that it was really this area. The second case is a dysplasia in the frontal pole. You see here very typical finding in MRI and PET hypermetabolism, some interictal spiking in the sphenoidal electrode, and some impaired nonverbal learning. So that's all consistent here. And you see here, well, at this time we had a good equipment to perform studies for cognition in patients with epilepsy. Well, this was unfortunately the end of this part of this study, but you see a symptomatology which, again, who would have said that this is coming from the temporal lobe? Temporal pole specifically. You would have said it's a temporal pole seizure.
I think it's possible because it was a
Okay. So here again you see this is the pole, very rapid spread to the amygdala and hippocampus, and you see, so this is pole, origin, amygdala and hippocampus here, very early involved within a few seconds, and then you see already here spread to the frontal regions, and this explains the semiology. So now coming back to the literature. So this study from Fong reported 4 patients with temporopolar seizure origin, and they reported of the 4 patients studied, each had a seizure semiology discordant with an ictal focus in the temporal lobe. The propagation network, so all were studied with SEEG, consisted of rapid engagement of orbitofrontal lobe, anterior insular, temporal-occipital junction, supramarginal, and angular gyri. So different types of spread and different types of semiologies in these 4 very nicely reported patients. And he also showed that these signs like early vocalization and hyperkinetic leg movements correlated with orbitofrontal spread, as we would have expected, and so on. Activation of frontal eye fields, activation of the primary motor area with clonic seizures in these patients. So not necessarily a temporal semiology as we would expect it to happen. And there have been quite a number of studies, and I just want to show you here a list of the signs that were reported as early signs and later signs. And you see that this is extremely variable. Yeah? So you can have epigraphic sensation, isolated staring, paresthesias of fingers of toes, just loss of consciousness, abdominal aura, déjà vu, disconnection, vocalization and hyperkinetic movements, fear aura, other psychic aura, not clearly described, cephalic aura, undescribable aura. You can have anxiety, behavioral arrest, speech arrest and staring, grimacing, laughter, hypermotor, auditory aura, and then hypermotor, and so on. So very different signs, even tunnel vision, nausea, déjà vu in patients with temporopolar origin. This is the largest series published from 23 patients, and again, it's not given very specifically to the subtype, but you see again, there is a long list of signs that was reported. You had motor symptoms, sensory, autonomic, psychic symptoms. You had different types, 10 types of auras in these 23 patients, out-of-body experiences, lingual tingling, clouding, and you had lots of other signs during impairment of consciousness like ictal speech, grimacing, oral elementary automatisms, and so on. There was one very good study from the group of Philippe Rivelin from Ms. Ostrowski, who did temporopolar stimulation and reported this in 30 patients. And I just show you the stimulation results without after discharges here. And you see again that there is quite a variability in what she reported. So from viscerosensitive, somatosensory, visceromotor, change in facial expression, auditory hallucinations, visual symptoms, psychic and autonomic. So an extremely wide spectrum of what you could also find with stimulation of this area without after discharges, and it gets even more when you have a greater area of spread with after discharges. So getting this together, this is the statistical analysis as we are expected to do. So the confidence in the epileptogenic zone was mostly very high in the single cases, and in the larger series, not very high because there was no real very localized resection done. And you see here the confidence in the epileptogenic zone that is limited because there were quite a number of patients in whom this was not very clearly reported, but there are certainly cases where it's very clear. The conclusions of some authors were, so Ostrowski said, the symptoms observed following stimulation of the anteromedial temporal polar cortex are reminiscent of those seen during stimulation of insular and mesiotemporal lobe structures. This suggests a low anatomical specificity of the symptoms. Wong suggested that if you have a hypermotor seizure, or hyperkinetic, as we would now say, we should search for temporal lobe pole pathology. And Fong again expressed that seizures can appear very heterogeneous and that this depends on the ictal propagation patterns. So the conclusion is that it really matters that there is lots of different types of propagation from this area, so you have connectivity to orbitofrontal, to insular, and to temporal regions, including even temporal posterior regions. So for any sign, individual sign that was reported in this series, none really was more frequent than 11%. So this again stresses the large heterogeneity of appearance in this temporal polar epilepsy. And you see here, this is already the highest numbers, and there were multiple other signs very rarely observed. So to conclude, first, from the semiology of mediolateral temporal lobe seizures, there were only 2 studies. Most semiological differences were between temporolateral and medial seizures, and the difference between mediolateral and pure medial and lateral was lower than this. There is a higher consensus between the papers only regarding early automatisms during seizures with mediolateral onset, and otherwise there is a wide overlap with other types of temporal seizures. When you look at temporal polar seizures, mostly small series were identified only, and there's a consistent reporting that there is a wide spectrum of semiologies with wide interpatient variability and infrequent individual signs, so there is no specific symptom of sign of the temporal pole, I would conclude, and the signs just reflect that there is a different type of spread of the ictal activity, and we certainly have to try to find out why the one or the other spread happens in order to understand why which symptomatogenic region in the temporal, insular, or frontal cortex is involved. Thank you very much.